NDTV Control ALT Defence, powered by IFFCO Tokyo. Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Control ALT Defence. Now, Vishnu and I, as you know, on this most watched and most listened to Indian defence podcast, have occasionally, at least once or twice in the last 12 episodes, stepped away from strictly focusing on defence because we also focus so much on aerospace and aviation. And how can we not talk about Air India Flight 171? The preliminary probe report is out. Vishnu is the journalist who scooped it before anyone else. We reported it overnight, and all of those details are now out in the public domain. And one of the things it has triggered is a very unseemly sort of face-off between the Western media and India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau that is investigating the crash itself. Now, Vishnu and I today are going to talk about two principal articles that have come out. One in the Wall Street Journal and one today at the time that we're recording this in Reuters, which have detailed, and I'm going to be listing them, Vishnu, right now before we jump into this, because they've triggered a very emotional sort of conversation. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of outrage.
And disbelief, I would
There's
suggest.
disbelief. There are people who are rejecting it. There are people who say that, there are vested interests at play. So what Vishnu and I are going to do today is discuss this threadbare, because both Vishnu and I are out there on social media where a lot of this conversation is actually taking place. And I can tell you people are not happy with some of the reporting around it. So we're going to be, as we always are on this podcast, no holds barred, completely honest. No part of it and no aspect of this is going to be, a no-go zone. And let me start by telling all of you that, as you've seen in this podcast, Vishnu is easily India's most proficient and most experienced aviation reporter. And that's the reason why on NDTV, on this podcast, on the channel, on our platforms, you've seen virtually every aspect of this story break first. And the reason why that's important is because, as we're going to discuss in this podcast, there also appears to be a vacuum of information that has led to some of the things being said. So Vishnu, I'm going to kick it off with your permission by first quoting some of the things in the Wall Street Journal report, and then we'll come to the Reuters report as well. So I'll quickly go through them just to set the stage for what this conversation is about. The Wall Street Journal article says in no uncertain terms, quoting officials, that Captain Sumit Sabharwal, who was the captain of the flight AI 171, is the one who moved the fuel switches from the run position to the cutoff position, essentially saying that he's the one who switched off the fuel supply to the engines. Co-pilot Clive Kundar, who was flying the aircraft, the pilot flying, expressed surprise and panic. Remember the preliminary report that Vishnu accessed and reported on first did specify that this happened, but did not specify which pilot actually did what. The Wall Street Journal is the first to do so. The Wall Street Journal also says that the captain remained calm. Captain Sabharwal remained calm. The Wall Street Journal article also very importantly says, and we will get into this a little deeper, that criminal authorities should review the matter as a potential crime rather than a safety mishap or an accident. Vishnu and I both know that the AAIB, India's AAIB, has issued a one-page rebuttal or a response.
It's
to
an
this.
appeal.
It's
That's
an appeal.
That's what
really
they call it. It's not a
saying-
rebuttal.
Yeah. But it's in direct response to the Wall Street
They're
Journal
basically
article.
telling people not to write stuff, but they haven't rejected anything which was written per se.
Yeah, they haven't denied any of the information, but they have said,
And they've certainly not accepted it either. Yeah.
they've basically said that this is irresponsible, unverified, and that it and it's one-sided.
Lots of adjectives.
Yeah, lots of adjectives, but no denial of the information in that article. The Reuters article, which was a follow-up to what the Wall Street Journal has reported, Vishnu, today takes things and makes them even more specific. It says, a cockpit recording of dialogue between the two pilots of Air India flight that crashed last month supports the view that the captain, that is Sumit Sabharwal, cut the flow of fuel to the plane's engines. This is according to their sources. Briefed on the US officials' early assessment of evidence. Point number 2 in the Reuters article, The circumstantial evidence increasingly indicates that a crew member flipped the engine fuel switches and that there was no other rational explanation that was consistent with the information released to date. Vishnu, your opening thoughts on both these articles and what they've said.
You know, what I found particularly interesting about the latest Reuters piece is that it refers to a statement, it has a statement from the NTSB chief. And that statement from that NTSB chief is something worth really looking at closely. And the NTSB chief, Jennifer Homendy, says, right, and the article mentions that she's been briefed about all aspects of this particular crash. Remember, the NTSB, the US National Transport Safety Board, very much a part of the investigations. They are the gold standard of investigations like that. They investigate not just air crashes, but also boat accidents, other forms of transport accidents. And this particular article says the safety of international air travel depends on learning as much as we can from these rare events so that industry and regulators can improve aviation safety. And if there are no immediate safety issues discovered, we need to know that as well. To me, this is a very direct statement. It doesn't get more direct because people such as the NTSB chief would know about the sensitivities and what they're seeing in social media, how this is playing out in India. This is important because this is a gentle nudge, perhaps not even that gentle, to the AAIB, India's investigator, saying, get on with it. Things seem to be quite important. And if there is no technical problem or mechanical issue, defect with the aircraft, say that. It's not good enough for you to not say that. But here's the rub. The moment the AAIB comes out with a statement, potentially, that there's nothing wrong with the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, then what are you left with? You're left with the entire series of arguments that the pilots may have been responsible somehow, indirectly, behind the crash. The AIB is not clear at this stage, whether that's the case or whether they want to go that far in terms of what they actually have to say. And it's quite clear to me that despite the appeal of the AIB that, you are vitiating the process of investigations in India. They've used lots of strong language. They've called the things being said by the Wall Street Journal and others as being unfounded. The fact of the matter is that, it's not stopping anybody from writing. The horse is bolted. Somebody has the NTSB, the data recording, the cockpit voice recorders, whatever they've had to say.
Would that cockpit voice recording be with the United States right now, with the agencies there?
Yeah, so
They
that's
would
what
have a
this-
copy of it?
Yeah, so let me repeat. Here's the paragraph from the Reuters article. The U.S. National Transport Safety Board has been assisting with the Air India investigation. Its chair, Jennifer Homendy, has been fully briefed on all aspects. That includes the cockpit voice recording and details from the flight data recorder that the NTSB team assisted the AIB in reading out. She knows everything.
So in that case, Vishnu, I wanted to ask this question
Word
a little
for
later,
word.
but let me ask it right away then. Then for what possible reason did the preliminary report of the AAIB not contain a full transcript of the conversation? The only scrap that's there in the report is an indirect paraphrased quote. It's not even a direct quote.
The AAIB chief was asked that question, and there's an interesting little bit in a wonderful article, I believe, in the Times of India this morning, where it says that he's under no legal obligations per ICAO guidelines to actually release the transcripts. But there are ICAO guidelines, and mind you, the ICAO guidelines have also said that India was not obliged to actually come out with a preliminary report. Why, it could have been deemed to be a secret and we could have held it. Why did we actually decide not to do that? In the name of transparency. So now the thing is that you can't be selective in that transparency, right? And while you may not have reached a full understanding of the exact causes of this crash, or because there's never just one reason, there should be enough over there of data which needs to be shared without the process necessarily being vitiated. Why is it that Air India has said that the Dreamliner is safe? Why is it that they have evidently listened to what the US FAA, that's in the Federal Aviation Administrator, the FAA said the Dreamliner is safe. Air India has bought that argument. There is nothing in the preliminary report that says that the plane has a problem with it. Here you have the NTSB chairperson saying that, no, look, If there isn't a problem with the plane, then you need to say so directly. So, the fact of the matter is that India doesn't want to say that directly, not just yet. Why? Because it's on terribly uncomfortable terrain right now. This affects the.
Because then that puts the spotlight on the
It
pilots.
puts the spotlight on the pilots. There is obviously, therefore, information that needs to be spread about whether there's a criminal investigation which is already underway. The Reuters piece, the Wall Street Journal piece earlier on seemed to suggest that there needed to have been, or there needs to be,
An FBI type.
a full-fledged criminal investigation in India. Perhaps that's happened and they aren't telling us about that so far. That's also a possibility. Apparently, there is a Director General ranked officer as part of this entire process. So look, you can't be selective about the information what are we talking about now? We are not talking about a national security issue. We are not talking about India's nuclear launch codes. You're talking about a situation in which 260 people died the most horrific death, right? And therefore, if there is to be a process of accountability in the year 2025, I dare say that process of accountability is often expressed through the media. And therefore, you need to have had a media strategy. You need to have had people telling you that if you've got X number of international investigators involved, if there is the entire world which is watching you right now, it involves not just any number of people, but airlines across the world, those who operate the Dreamliner, then you need to have been in a position to release a lot more and rule in stuff and rule out stuff.
This is a little ironic to me, and sorry to interrupt, but this is ironic to me. What you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is then incredibly ironic, because it suggests that the AAIB, in its effort to maybe
Be
preclude
transparent.
an uncomfortable situation,
Yeah.
has probably catalyzed it.
Exactly. Shiv, there are leaks which are this is leaking like a sieve. I mean, it's leaking like there's no tomorrow, right? You've had two Wall Street Journal articles and I think two Reuters articles as well. The first one was by an excellent aviation correspondent, John Ostrober, who was once with the Wall Street Journal, now runs an
The Wall Street pinched his article, actually. Yeah.
He had a problem with that separate point, but he runs an extremely the Air Current, which is a well-known trade journal, aviation journal. So it's out there. And I think it's out there, and people are coming out with selective parts of the information because there is a sense that that's what it is, that the pilots had a direct role, and it is time for India to be saying that. But I do also believe there are aspects of what the AAIB said. And as journalists, we have to report both sides, which we need to reflect on as well and keep our minds open. So, in fact, Shiv, that's what our viewers and our listeners have to understand. Your mind is not made up. My mind is not made up. We are not for a moment saying that it is pilot error. We are not saying that it is a mechanical error. We don't know. But what we demand is a credible release of information in a time-bound manner and in a manner which takes into account the fact that this is detail which is being shared now, not just with India, with every part of the world, and that it may not be enough to say that a demand for information is going to vitiate the process of the inquiry, because the fact of the matter is it does appear that there's a nudge from the NTSB chair over there saying, get on with the process. There has been not one advisory saying that Dreamliners need to be grounded after the crash. So let's not right size the potential or attempt to right size the potential impact of this investigation.
Yeah.
If you have something, let's have more details. And what is the detail that necessarily should have come out by now? That 10 seconds of a conversation, which would actually let people know what is happening inside the cockpit of the plane.
I want to.
What if there was a mind fog of the pilot? What if it isn't an alleged suicide at all? What if instead of lifting the undercarriage in some bizarre way, here is a pilot who's gone and switched off the engines? Is that therefore suicide? Is that a mistake? Is that brain fog? Can we use the word suicide at all? We need to read that transcript to see where this is actually headed. It may not be that at all.
Yeah.
And if it is something to do with pilots and something wrong that they've done, then let's confront that. We're a big country, we aren't a small nation. We have a massive booming aviation sector. This is a company, Air India, the Tatas, who want to get on with the business of aviation. It's one of the world's legacy air carriers. They've just placed a record number of orders along with Indigo for aircraft. Around the world, the world has not seen so many orders, right? So, if there is a problem as this sector expands, these things tragically, even though they are very remote, sometimes happen. You need to be able to communicate that, not in an obtuse manner by right sizing the information that you release, but by actually, in this particular case, coming out and saying, here is the transcript of these, and then let people decide this.
The Wall Street Journal and Reuters, and I just want to get into the journalistic part of this for just a moment, because I'm trying to understand what the reporters would have had access to when they were speaking to their sources. Is it possible, and you've read both these articles, Vishnu, in the Wall Street Journal and Reuters, is it possible that they've been shared transcripts, or had a chance to actually listen to some of that audio? Because that audio is, of course, privileged information. So is it possible that they've had a chance to listen to more than what's been put out by the AAIB already?
So let's just go through the first line of that Reuters article, and that gives us an answer. A cockpit recording of dialogue between the two pilots of the Air India flight that crashed last month supports the view that the captain cut the flow of fuel to the plane's engine, said a source briefed on US officials' early assessment of evidence. US officials have got a basic idea of what happened. That source, who they are quoting, who they believe to be reliable, has accessed that report, and they believe that this process has worked to their editorial checks and balances and safeguards based on what they believe to be a reliable process, so they've gone and reported it. Somebody in the system obviously has it, and whether they've been read out or they've actually heard it, and there's a great possibility that they would have heard it. I'll tell you why. If I was confronted by the same situation, by somebody who is a source and tells me that this is what the pilot said in the cockpit, what would your first reaction be?
Yeah.
Let me hear it, right? No matter who the source is, how reliable they may be, if you're putting your professional credibility on the line and are making allegations about something very serious, such as a pilot-induced crash, then the first thing you say is, no, let me see it, let me read it. Now, in fact, for me, it wouldn't be good enough to just read it,
But to hear it as well.
to hear it, because the tone,
Tonality.
the tonality is critical in this situation. The tension, whether the voices conveyed that, they live for only 30 seconds, Shiv.
Yeah.
I mean, and they were killed, were these pilots, and so we need to understand that. But look, it's out there, and I don't think anybody is going to hold back on this information despite this appeal. So we're in a real mess when it comes to the process of communicating all of this, and I'm going to be hated by the AIB for saying this.
Do you think the AAIB, after putting out this appeal, this statement, 4-paragraph, 1-page statement, an appeal, for the media in general not to jump the gun, do you think that this is going to be followed up with a greater degree of information sharing? Do you think that we should expect that maybe they'll put out the cockpit voice recording transcript now?
Well, I don't know if they're going to do that, but they have said that as and when information is available, they are going to actually talk about it. So I'm just going to quote from that report, and I've got exactly that. The AIB appeals to all concerned to await publication of the final investigation report after completion of the investigation. AIB will also publish updates as and when required,
Last
which
line.
have technical and public interest.
That is an interesting line. Technical and public interest. How do they define public interest in this case? What is your understanding
Well,
of that line? I
Shiv,
found that line very, very strange.
I find that line somewhat encouraging. I mean, it just goes. I would say that line means that they will come out with more press releases. For us, information hungry journalists looking to get the inside story of the a horrific accident, the worst we've seen in so many years. The worst since the Charkhi Dadri disaster in terms of the number of people who died, and that was way back in 1996 over Indian skies. That just gives us a little bit of hope that they'll give because a report like this can take a year to come out.
Yeah.
And cynics would actually say that if the later the report comes out, the less impact it might have in the minds of people who may have forgotten about what exactly happens. The new news flows change, people's memories are short except those who've been directly impacted. And therefore, if information on something controversial emerges in that final report and that comes out later on, then perhaps it'll be more quote unquote acceptable to people around. I'm being careful in the words that I use.
Yeah.
However, then there is the other perspective, which I stand for, that if there is information and you are in a position to rule out things, then rule out things, come out with what this says, and while making the point that, hang on a second, we aren't done with it. Therefore, if there is clear evidence that the pilots or one of the pilots moved the fuel switches, that entire sequence of events, come out with that. You may not be in a position right now, pending an investigation, to understand why one of the pilots may or may not have done that. As I said in the beginning of this podcast, there could be several factors, if indeed that happened at all. But then, in a situation where people are hungry for information,
Yeah.
and you've got international investigators nudging you for information, why not? Why not come out with that? That's something that needs to be looked at very, very closely.
What possible public interest would not be served? Let me ask this another way. Would not be served by putting out more information or perhaps even the entire cockpit voice recording transcript?
Well, they seem to suggest that that vitiates the process of an inquiry which is not complete. It is essential to respect the sensitivity of the loss faced by family members of the deceased crew of the aircraft and deceased persons on the ground. It's come to our attention that certain sections of the international media are repeatedly attempting to draw conclusions through selective and unverified reporting. Well, then verify it. Such actions are irresponsible, is what I say. Such actions, the AIB says, are irresponsible, especially while the investigation remains ongoing. We urge the public and media to refrain from spreading
Vishnu,
premature narratives that risk undermining the integrity of the investigative
now
process.
I don't know how it
Impacts the
impacts the
integrity.
integrity of the process. I think that's just verbiage.
Stretching it.
But I actually agree in some ways with the AAIB when they say that there has been a repeated attempt to jump to conclusions. Even if you put aside what the Wall Street Journal and Reuters have reported, we've seen YouTubers, we've seen other parts of the Western media from the beginning put out the idea of pilot error. Now, initially there was pilot error as one possibility. It still is. Pilot error or pilot suicide is a possibility. That is the strange space that you and I occupy right now, actually. And it perhaps is one of the reasons why we're often attacked. It's because our minds are still open to the possibility of something.
That's right.
But the outrage, which I think finds an echo in this statement from the AAIB, which I actually agree with, is the idea that those pushing the pilot suicide theory attempt to push it by saying this is the only possibility.
Right.
And there is no other possibility. And therefore, any other track to this investigation can safely be concluded and closed.
So, Shiv, that's one interpretation of that. And if you look at the way in which the articles are written, they are fairly definitive in saying that this is what the pilots did in the cockpit according to information that we have sourced. But nowhere have they sort of said that what the attempt of the pilots was. But what has been reported is an extrapolation of that information, and that extrapolation, some would suggest, may not be entirely incorrect, simply because of the design of the fuel control switches. That extrapolation would be journalistically valid to carry. Why? Because the preliminary report of the AIB nowhere says that fuel flow to the engines was shut off through a system or a failure in any other part of the aircraft. What they did say is that the fuel control switches transitioned from the on to the cutoff position, right? And shortly thereafter, in the timeline of events which the AIB did release, there was a loss of thrust. So the link over there is direct. So coming back to the earlier point, if you look at how this has been reported, they've just reported it straight, but they've not said that this is pilot suicide.
Yeah.
Nowhere has it been said by Wall Street Journal or Reuters that this is clear evidence of pilot suicide.
They
They've
just
not
said the
used that
pilots
word.
did it.
They've said that the pilots did
Captain
it.
Sabharwal did it, is what they say.
And and Reuters in this piece has quoted experts as well who say that there's a lot more that needs to be investigated. And that's what the AIB has also said, that, we aren't really done with the investigations. And that is important. Um, and so we have to respect the AIB when it says that, our job is to actually get to the bottom of this, and we need time and we need an effort to try and do this. But in a scenario like this, where the flow of information needs to be handled deftly and carefully, it really does boil down to whether or not the pilots did move those switches. And if they did, then you can't right size that information.
Yeah.
At the best case scenario, if that is true, it's a dreadful mistake. In the worst case scenario, it points to something larger. Surely the public needs to know that. And how do they know that? Not through a cursory couple of words which have been paraphrased, but by that transcript. I will also say, Shiv, that I do believe that pilots from our various associations who say that they need to be a part of this process, I think they have a valid point.
Yeah.
I think they completely have a valid point. Why not have them there? They will be confronted with the same data. They will be confronted by the same facts. They have a strong set of beliefs as well. Maybe their beliefs might be correct. Maybe they will understand that their beliefs are wrong. Ultimately, it's a process of several professionals from around the world coming together, help draft this report.
But the anger at this point by those pilots associations, Vishnu, and the reason why it's come to this point is this growing sense that there are these unignorable vested interests at play. There are ready examples of this being the case, even in our recent memory, with the 737 Max and other issues. And pilots associations, like you yourself said, are not wrong to feel aggrieved at this point of time, because there is this sense, like I said, that they're being scapegoated, that the pilots are being scapegoated even before a 15-page preliminary report has been allowed
And
to
no one's there to defend them. I mean,
to
they aren't there
evolve
to
into
defend
what could
themselves.
potentially be a report that is thousands of pages long. So the question I want to ask you then is, are they wrong to feel aggrieved about it and to feel cornered and offended by what's being reported? Because the Wall Street Journal and Reuters are news agencies. They are news agencies reporting what they hear. And at many levels, and I've said this on my show as well, that many of us would do the same. In an information vacuum, we would go with the information that we gain access to from our sources and our contacts. But are these pilots associations right to be aggrieved and angry about what's happening?
I think they're all in a sense of shock about some of the allegations which have been made. They feel that in the absence of a full report, those conclusions cannot be made. But I don't believe that the arguments that they have made to justify that position are viable, given what the preliminary report says, given the fact that the FAA has said that the plane is safe, given the fact that there have been checks not just in Air India but airlines around the world which have said that the throttle quadrant and the fuel switches are all right. And therefore, if there is nothing wrong with that, and we do know that the pilot switched off the fuel control switches, even in the preliminary report of the AIB, there's frankly nothing left. I mean, that is what needs to be investigated. However, if there is an argument that it's a mechanical defect, as many of the pilots say, or that there is a software issue, which many of the pilots say, and if they do demand that some of them who are proficient in the aircraft need to be a part of the investigation, then I think there is no harm in them at least being observers to that entire process. I mean, if we are going to be transparent, then why not be transparent by including as observers representatives of pilots' bodies? They represent any number of pilots, and some of the people who would be on board would be, people with tens of thousands of hours of experience, possibly even on the Dreamliner.
Vishnu,
I also think that independent engineers
yeah,
need to have been on board as well,
absolutely,
not
absolutely.
just
Yeah,
pilots.
no, the composition of the investigative team has been a bone of contention, and rightfully so. I had Mary Schiavo on my show yesterday. We've had others as well who've been skeptical about the things that have been reported so far. And one of the specific tracks that this entire story has taken is that the circumstantial evidence itself is not
It's
conclusively
not.
something that points to pilot action. She herself said it. Many others have said it. A panel of experts, pilots have said, why are you saying the pilots did it when there have been instances of the fuel switches going from run to cutoff without someone literally putting their hands there and pulling those switches down? They frequently cite a 2019 incident when this happened. There are a couple of other instances in which when this has happened. From your understanding, of how these switches work, uh, would the cockpit voice audio be enough to establish that Captain Sabharwal, as Reuters and Wall Street Journal are reporting, literally moved his hands to the quadrant and pulled those switches down?
In conjunction, the cockpit voice recording, in conjunction with the timing of from the flight data recorder of the switches transitioning, would be enough evidence, I would suggest, on what happened, so that the quality of the conversation recording is very, very important.
Correct.
As far as the earlier instances of fuel control switches, there have been no problems with fuel control switches. And let's just run through a couple of separate points. There was in 2018 or so an advisory asking airlines around the world to monitor the fuel control switches to make sure that that component was faulty. If that to check to ensure that the component wasn't faulty. Various airlines would have listened to that recommendation. It wasn't mandatory. Air India didn't do it because it wasn't mandatory. But in the case of this particular plane registered VT A and B, the throttle quadrant, which includes the fuel switches, was changed twice, the last time being 2023. Since then, Air India voluntarily went and checked the fuel control switches of their entire fleet of Boeings, whether it's the Boeing 737 MAX or the Boeing 787, and they've not found any defect. Etihad, I believe, was one of the airlines which independently announced, that look, we want to do the same. Apart from that, other airlines around the world would have done it. It's a fairly simple process to see whether the lock mechanism is broken or damaged in any particular way. The US FAA, one of their regulators, made the point very early on that there is nothing wrong with that fuel control mechanism. So therefore, what exactly are you looking at this juncture? As far as that ANA incident is concerned, and you referred to a 2019 incident when there was a rollback of thrust on a Dreamliner. ANA was the first operator of the Dreamliner in the world. This was an incident which took place after a Dreamliner landed in, I believe, Osaka. And there was an uncommanded rollback of thrust, and it was believed to have been a software issue. But there were certain designs, software designs, which exist on the Dreamliner to ensure that a rollback of thrust takes place once the aircraft is on the ground. That rollback of thrust is not supposed to take place once the aircraft is in the air. And a final point over here in the preliminary report, it does say that sensors on the aircraft transitioned from ground to air. In other words, the software knew the plane was flying. In that scenario, there hasn't been an incident on the Boeing 787 that we are aware of where there's been a rollback of thrust. Now, that isn't to say
Yeah,
that
it's not
that's
possible.
not possible. It just seems to be difficult, and if that has to be proven, then that has to be proven. In the meanwhile, all we want to know is, did the pilot switch off the switches or not? Because in any which way you look at it, that is completely, utterly unacceptable, other than the fact that there was some raging engine fire, which was clearly not the case.
Would the
And no one switches off both engines.
yeah, so
Fuel switches.
with the given the way aircraft are designed, the number of different audio and tactile warnings and that kind of thing that are built into sophisticated aircraft, and the Dreamliner is one of the most sophisticated wide bodies, Vishnu, if those switches had been turned off by someone, would the cockpit voice audio have recorded some kind of a warning, any kind of warning?
Any number of beeps, buzzers, master cautions, conversations of pilots, even the clicking sound of the fuel control switch moving from one position to the other would possibly be caught as well. It's not just one source of audio recording, it's more than that. It's, these are area mics, they're not directional. This is directional. So, it picks up what I'm speaking about. It doesn't pick up what people behind me are speaking about. But if you have area mics, then they tend to pick up audio from a larger expanse, and it's not just one.
Yeah.
And the data is sensitive, or the systems are sensitive enough to establish this is coming from pilot 1 or it's coming from pilot 2. And so you would know a lot of information over there. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Air India itself has said that there are no mechanical errors with the Boeing 787.
Yeah.
Has Air India issued a statement so far saying that our pilots were not responsible in any way in putting off the switches, or we do not believe our pilots were involved in any way in any incident which is untoward in this have they said that? No.
Aircraft, yeah, true. I mean, absolutely. That's a important question to ask. Vishnu, almost a question that frequently comes up, and I've seen a lot of people ask it and haven't gotten a satisfactory answer. So I'm going to ask you because you've been looking at this so closely. Is the aircraft was a few hundred feet from the ground when all these things went wrong.
Yeah.
Uh, these are sophisticated aircraft that have been designed to be incredibly safe and override unsafe actions and things like that. Explain to us why the aircraft, in such a sensitive phase of flight, which is when it's climbing out and just a few hundred feet from the ground, have allowed something like this to happen. Shouldn't survivability and safety features on an aircraft have not permitted fuel cutoff
Yeah,
so
you're
close to
quite
the
right.
ground?
The fuel cutoff switches in this aircraft, and it's a similar setup in other Boeing aircraft as well, is designed implicitly to ensure that an accidental hand cannot do that. But it's not designed to prevent a deliberate hand from moving those switches, because there are particular circumstances when you might want to switch off an engine. For example, if there is
During takeoff?
or in any phase of the flight. If there is an engine fire, right, one of the things that you do, as I understand it, is that you throttle down the engine which is impacted. You you cut off the fuel switch and you discharge the fire extinguisher. Now, you would never do that on both the engines, even if there was a dual engine failure, because the last thing that you want is a thrust lost in both engines, even if there is a fire over there. Typically, however, in a very, very critical period of flight, I'm not sure whether pilots would instantly switch it off, or they would get to a minimum altitude before they expended the extinguisher, cut off, throttle down, switched off, expended the fuel, the fire extinguisher. Not entirely certain about the sequence of that either. But just to get back to the switches themselves, there are guardrails on both sides, so your hand can't go there. It's not a lever which moves up and down like that. It's something that you lift up like this, push down, let go of. You have to lift it 2.8 millimeters.
Like the reverse gear
Yeah.
in your car.
And it gets stuck in the position that it's in, unless you lift it up and then you move it to the position. And as I've been saying on our broadcast as well, I have a car which has I drive a manual transmission car, and I've got a spring mounted mechanism which prevents me from switching the gearbox or shifting the gear from first to reverse. So reverse is over here. If I want to reverse, it's a spring loaded mechanism. I lift it and then I move to reverse. It protects me, because when I'm driving, the last thing I want is to suddenly switch to reverse and not first, which is what I'm trying to do. So again, this is a spring mounted mechanism. It's a safety mechanism. The design is obviously different. And the comparison I made is superficial, but it is designed to protect pilots from this situation. Now, if you were to ask, why isn't there additional safety on that? Should there be a box on top of the switches? The counter answer is that if you're in a critical period, for example, you've crash landed the aircraft, there is something critical which is happening, there's a raging fire. Do you want a pilot to expend more time to try and remove a structure or anything else and then go about switching off, or do you want them to just quickly go and switch it off? So there is incredible thinking which goes into cockpit ergonomics, the design of various systems, and this is a factor that. So going back to my initial point, none of this works if there's a deliberate attempt at switching off. It just doesn't. It's not designed.
Incredible. I mean, so if the aircraft doesn't have an additional layer of safety or warning, it's precisely what you're saying, which is that if someone wants to do it, how many layers of safety can you actually add to an
And there are
aircraft?
many other ways of doing something wrong with an aircraft. I don't want to get into that line of conversation because then it veers this conversation to a direct use of the word suicide, which I'm reluctant to do. None of the media reports have sort of directly said that. There has always been an indication of that having potentially taken place.
Yeah.
But we need to keep our minds open, and I think that's the goal of this podcast. And I think it's important once again, Shiv, for our viewers and listeners to understand. Vishnu is not saying that this was pilot suicide. Shiv is not saying it was pilot suicide. We are not saying it's software either. We're not saying it's a mechanical area, issue either. We are saying whatever it is, there needs to be a credible flow of information. We're also saying that there are independent media who, on the basis of the information that they have collected, which evidently seems to be the cockpit voice recordings, will report parts of that. They are not bound by the appeal of the AAIB. The international media works on a sense of transparency and independence in reporting and their own editorial constructs which work for them. And on the basis of that, if they feel necessary or they get the information, they will even report more, I would suspect. Even what they have reported so far, which has not, as a specific point, been denied by the AAIB, right, is something which one needs to take a note of.
Final
They've not
point.
denied
Then,
it, Shiv.
yeah, absolutely. They haven't
They've
denied
said
it.
we appeal and these reports are unfounded. You have not said that the pilot did not move the fuel switch from on to cutoff. The pilots have not had any role in doing this. Have you said that? No.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right.
So what does that indicate to anyone?
I actually hope that what you said about that last line in that statement by the AIB is true. That when they say technical interest and public interest, it means that it's an encouraging sign that there will be, a
Well, they've
bigger
committed themselves
flow of
to it now.
information. When you speak to pilots right now, when you speak to people, on our shows, and we've had so many of them, Captain Mohan Ranganath and many others as well, uh, it's become a very polarized, a kind of full of sentiment and emotions and things which are usually things that don't go well with a technical debate, right? There's a lot of that, and I asked Captain Sam Thomas that, and he said, this is a technical debate, but how can one ignore the emotions?
Yeah, you
When
can't.
there are vested interests involved. 260 people are dead, Vishnu, and answers have to happen. And like you rightly said, there are no easy answers. Whichever way
Shiv, I
this goes, it's
disagree
going to
with
be
the
an
use.
uncomfortable
Shiv, I disagree
result.
with the use of the word by anybody of a vested interest. Now, let's be
Yeah,
sort of.
I want you to address that bit.
Let me try and do that. This entire vested interest business. That there are some pilots who say that Boeing is going to lose a great deal, and this is Boeing which is leaking all of these things to say that the pilot somehow went and crashed their plane. There are others who are saying that GE needs to protect its stock and whatever it is, massive company, and therefore they are leaking information. Just for the sake of wild argument, let us assume that we accept that for just half a second. I don't, but let us accept that for half a second. Would the NTSB, the FAA, the British regulator, and ICAO observer, India's own AAIB, would they all have said thus far that the Dreamliner is essentially a safe aircraft? Right? Have they in any way, let me rephrase that, have they in any way said the Dreamliner is not safe?
No, they haven't. Yeah.
So
At
therefore,
all.
where is this conspiracy theory against GE and Boeing coming from? It's coming from people who are deeply emotional. Believe me, Shiv, this report came 30 days after the crash, the preliminary report. The NTSB and the others were there on day one when the data was found finally downloaded. It took a few days for that to happen. They wouldn't have waited 5 minutes if they found out that there was a systemic issue evident on the Dreamliner there and then. They would have grounded that fleet around the world, 1,000 plus aircraft, instantly. Why? It's their job to save lives. So, what are we talking about? That's not happened. So, where is the vested interest? You've got regulators over there to prevent vested interests from, pushing a particular agenda.
And this is the same NTSB that went up against Boeing on
And
the
how?
737 MAX.
And how?
Yeah.
Right? There's the Canadian investigator as well. They have a fantastic. The Canadians died, as you recall, in this crash. There's no vested interest over here. It's this entire flow of information. It's it's a battle, and I pitched this on my show last night, between a notion of transparency, that if you have information, you need to come out with this information, and even this basic information that you have is enough, versus a quote unquote rigorous investigative process.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I don't believe the rigor in your investigative process is going to be impacted by the release of critical information, particularly since that information impacts the reputation of those two pilots, their families, uh, whatever it is, and ultimately people have a right to know. 260 people have died.
They have a right to know. And that brings me to my final question, Vishnu, which is that the preliminary report is 15 pages long. You've, through your career, read many crash reports and final reports, and they run into hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages. Can things dramatically change between an interim report and a
Yes.
final report?
Yes,
They can?
they can. And I do agree. And if that is the reason why the regulator is holding back on information, it's an argument that needs to be looked at. But I think prima facie, the information at this stage is fairly strong. The regulators around the world don't believe it was the aircraft. There is a certain line of questioning which has emerged from the role of the pilots. Clear it up one way or the other. Don't hold back on this information, because your appeal to the media isn't going to work. They obviously have access to the cockpit voice recorder information. It's as simple as that.
260 people have died. All of the families are waiting for that information. This is a story that isn't just about India, it's really about the world. There are many reputations here, but it is finally not about reputations, not about narrative, not about right sizing information, as Vishnu said. It is finally about the truth of what happened to Flight AI 171. And I can promise you for certain about Vishnu and me, about NDTV, about this podcast, and about all of our platforms here in our group, that we will continue to ask the questions so we get closer and closer and closer to the truth of what happened. Thanks so much for watching.
Thank you.